Thank you, Arthur, for that kind introduction. So let me tell you the story about how has the community dealt with the problem of MEV. Fan has done an excellent job in telling you the lay of the land. So there have been two radically different approaches that the community has taken. The first approach is what I call the systematization of value extraction. This approach assumes that the extraction is inevitable as validators are rational agents. And some validators have less capabilities than the other validators. So the approach just focuses on every validator having access to the most profitable block. And this is largely called as proposer-builder separation. And Fan talked about MEV boost, which is the current instantiation of PBS. Now, the thing to note here is that often the profits that are coming to the validators are at the expense of ordinary users. And this leaves ordinary users vulnerable to systematic value extraction. So in effect, the balance of power is heavily tilted towards validators, and users are vulnerable, as shown here. And validators have enjoyed this power, right? You can see that the proportion of blocks that are built through PBS has rapidly increased to more than 90%. And this validates the assumption that validators are, in fact, rational players, and we should think about them in the same model. The second class of radically different approach is what I call fair ordering, which has a couple of other sub-approaches in it. The first one is temporal fair ordering, which basically decentralizes the ordering task among a set of validators based on their local timestamps at which they receive the transactions. The second one, which is complementary to this sub-approach, is called blind ordering, which orders these transactions based on just the fees that they pay, doesn't look at the contents of these transactions, and it can be enforced through either TE or threshold encryption through a committee. Now, this class of work has seen a very rapid development in the academic community, and largely this work has remained in academia with very little adoption in practice. And the reason for that is while this work protects users, well, why would a rational validator adopt fair ordering if they're getting all these juicy profits from PBS, right? So in effect, ordinary users would be happy, but validators are unclear why they should even opt into it because they are rational agents. There's also some externality here where there's latency racing for the top of the block in some of the cases. Okay. So the question that we ask in this work is it possible to build a system where you can protect users in light of the fact that validators are rational agents? And while this work is academic, I want to highlight that from the day one, we have approached this work from a very practical point of view, as you will see in the rest of the talk. So let me introduce you to the work called PROF, Protected Order Flow in a Profit-Seeking World. The mechanism for PROF is simple. It's backward compatible, means it's compatible with the current way blocks are being produced. It protects users without service degradation. I'll talk about what we mean by that in detail. And it accounts for rational validators. All right, so the summary of the design for PROF is you have the system called PROF. It ingests private transactions. These transactions, in a sense, should be sent exclusively to PROF, but if those transactions are coming from mempool, that's also fine. PROF orders these transactions in a bundle, and I'll talk about how these transactions can be ordered in a fair way, but essentially PROF constructs a fairly ordered transaction bundle. It then takes in a block, which is produced outside PROF, and then it enriches that block with the bundle, which is fairly ordered. Now, you would notice that this bundle is appended to the end of the PROF, at the end of the original block. And so if the original block gave you a reward R, the PROF-enriched block will give you a reward R plus epsilon, where epsilon is just the fee coming from PROF transactions. All right, so from a validator's perspective, which block should the validator choose? Well, there's a block B that gives you a reward R, and there's an enriched block that gives you slightly higher reward that is coming from the fees that's charged to PROF transactions. It's clear that if validators are rational agents, even if epsilon is small, they should prefer the PROF-enriched block. From a user's perspective, should the user send their transactions to the mempool, or should users send their transactions to PROF, where if they send their transactions to mempool, they are vulnerable to risk of extraction, versus if they send their transaction to PROF, they can pay an epsilon fees for incentivizing inclusion of those transactions. Now, note that PROF should protect these transactions in the sense that these transactions should not be vulnerable to extraction, and I'll talk about how we enforce that. Now, let me talk about the details of the design. So as I said, it's backward compatible. So let's look at how blocks are being produced currently. This is the PBS architecture. You don't have to look at the details, but the main thing here to note is that validators are receiving most profitable block from the supply chain. This is mediated through this trusted auctioneer, which is auctioning off the blocks and choosing the best block for the validator. For the purposes of this talk, you can just assume this abstract view of PBS, where there's a supply chain represented by builders here. Builders are sending their blocks to the relay, and the relay is choosing the best block for the validator. Now, the key insight in PROF is you have an alternate where a PROF-enhanced relay would just append PROF transactions to the best block coming from the PBS auction. So the best blocks are being selected by PROF, and then at the end of it, you have appended transactions, and the validator is given a choice. It can either choose the original block that is coming from the auction, or it can choose an enrichment of that block that is coming from PROF, which will give its higher reward, as I mentioned. So the validator is given a choice of take it or leave it. PROF enforces the choice that if the validator leaves these transactions out, the validator learns nothing about the transactions. This is the key insight. The validator is either taking the PROF transactions, or it has to leave those transactions and it learns nothing about those transactions. All right. So the question is, why should relays support PROF? Well, relays are also competing in this ecosystem. They're competing to have market share of how many blocks are included through that relay. So all else equal, a relay that supports PROF, PROF-enhanced relays, would be more competitive. That is, they would be producing more profitable blocks for the validator, and so their market share would increase. And the workflow for builders remains unchanged. So now let me talk about the details of how we enforce the take it or leave it guarantee from PROF. So this is the current PBS workflow, where there's a supply chain, some blocks are being built by builders, and they're being sent to the relay. What the relay does here is it sends a header of those blocks to the validator, which is essentially a bid that if you choose this header, it has an associated value associated with it. And if the validator commits to including that bid, including that block, which is basically a signed header from the validator, then the relay can release the full block to the validator. This is how currently the blocks are being built in PBS. So note that the validator is first committing to the block without even seeing the contents of the block. So in some sense, it's a blind commitment from the validator, and it trusts that the relay is kind of validating the block and so on. OK. So now we are ready to dive into the details of the design of PROF. This is the design illustrated in a logical sense. So the PROF sequencer, for now, assume is a black box entity. It sends a PROF bundle to a PROF bundle merger, which is running at the relay. This PROF bundle merger essentially takes the best block coming from the auction, ingests it in the bundle merger, appends the PROF transactions to it, and then sends that block to the validator. And while it's kind of simulating these transactions and appending the transaction bundle, maybe the auction has proceeded, maybe you have a better bid from the auction. So the relay will make sure that it sends the best out of the two, the best block from the auction and the PROF-enriched block to the relay. Now, while the relay is trusted, we still want to run the PROF bundle merger inside a TE because it's just good to have defense in depth. If the relay, for example, is honest but curious, we want nobody to see the PROF transactions. That's why we, even if the relay is trusted, we want to run the PROF bundle merger inside a TE. All right. So here's the diagram for how the timeline would proceed during the block production. You have two concurrent paths. The orange path, which is the PBS path, that's the current path, and you would have a PROF path which runs concurrently to it. In the orange path, of course, you conduct the MEV auction. And in the blue path, which is the PROF path, you conduct the MEV auction, but at the end, you merge PROF bundle to the best block from the auction. At the end of it, you choose the best block coming out of these two paths and send the best block to the validator. Now, some of you might notice that if we run this auction a little bit, if we run this auction for a little bit shorter duration in the blue path, then that might lead to a suboptimal, a lesser block from the auction compared to the orange path. So yes, if you do end the auction a little bit earlier, there is some penalty in that sense. So for example, if you are ending your auction delta seconds earlier, and in Ethereum you have 12 seconds, for example, then you're ending the auction, you're running the auction in a sense for delta duration shorter, and we call it the latency penalty that you would incur in the auction path. Well, to compensate it, you have the fees from PROF transactions. So in a sense, the block that is enriched from PROF, it has a little bit of latency penalty from this bundle merging, but it also has the extra fee coming from PROF transactions. So the likelihood of inclusion of these PROF transactions would depend on whether the PROF enriched block is better than the PBS block, if the validators are rational. So let's see what the break-even equation looks like. You have these two competing equations for whether the PROF enriched block would be selected by the validator. So this is the latency penalty from real-world data. Here you can see that there are different percentiles for how much penalty you incur if you shorten your auction by a little bit. So for example, if you shorten your auction by, say, 85 milliseconds, then in 90% of the slots, you would produce a block which is 0.003 ETH, roughly about maybe $10, less than if you had run the auction for the full length. So this is the latency penalty which PROF needs to compensate from the fees charged to the PROF transactions. All right, so let's model this inclusion likelihood a little bit more formally. So the break-even equation for PROF, as I said, is the fees that is coming from PROF transactions, whether that's greater than the latency penalty. This fees in itself depends on the gas in the PROF bundle and the fee charged to the PROF bundle, which is basically gamma F, where gamma is the overhead on top of the base fee F. So there's a relationship between the inclusion likelihood alpha, the gas of using the PROF bundle, which is essentially the size of the PROF bundle, and the overhead that you need to charge PROF transactions. This is inclusion likelihood that we calculate from real-world data. Here you can see that as PROF transactions, the PROF bundle gets bigger and bigger, you use more and more gas in PROF transactions, the inclusion likelihood increases for the same overhead that is charged to the PROF transactions. So the colors represent the overhead that you're charging, so 0% on top of base fee, 2%, 4%, and so on. And for that overhead, if you increase the PROF bundle size, what's the likelihood of inclusion? So the takeaway from this slide is there is high inclusion likelihood, more than 95%, for charging very minimal fee. And that likelihood even increases as more and more users adopt PROF. OK, so we go a little bit, we go a step further. Let's look at some of the redistribution mechanisms of MEV. So many approaches in the industry have come up where they are protecting users, but they are also redistributing some MEV that was created from their transactions. So let's look at an example of how this redistribution is happening. Suppose Alice buys some ETH from an exchange, and it causes the price to go up on that exchange. An arbitrager could backrun Alice's transaction, profit off from that arbitrage opportunity, and redistribute some money back to Alice. So essentially, if the profit here was, say, $20 from the arbitrage could share some portion with the user, keep some portion for itself and the validator. So there have been these approaches that have been proposed. You could have similar approaches integrated with PROF. So the thing to focus here is you run in step 1, 2, 3 the same workflow for PROF. But then once the validator commits to the PROF block, you can actually release these transactions for backrunning to the public. And then the backrunners would compete to basically give value back to the users in the PROF bundle. So 1, 2, 3 is the normal workflow for PROF, and then you can enhance it with PROF-Share, where now you are conducting a backrunning auction. This is inspired from the approaches in industry, a la MEV Share and MEV Blocker. OK, so as I said, there are these approaches in industry that attempt to also prevent front running and redistribute MEV back to the users as well. Now, these approaches, while they are kind of attracting backrunning for these users, they still have to leak something about the user transactions in order to make it attractive for backrunners to backrun them. If the backrunners don't know anything about these transactions, how are they going to backrun them? So these approaches kind of have a trade-off between the privacy for the transactions and their attractiveness for the backrunners. And as Fan mentioned in his previous talk, these approaches are already pivotal in deciding who wins in these auctions. All right. So the other benefits of PROF-Share on top of redistribution to users, if you compare them specifically to the current approaches of redistribution, are as follows. The key insight here is that in PROF-Share, you can actually release these transactions once the validator commits to them. So the transactions are completely private. You don't have to leak anything about them until the validator commits, and then you release these transactions for backrunning. As a result, you have some nicer properties than other redistribution mechanisms. The first property, you might have guessed, is that you can now do more efficient backrunning because you know the full contents of the transactions. You can even do it off-chain. You don't have to do it through smart contracts, and it saves some gas as a result. Second, you might have noticed that when you do backrunning in the current mechanisms, you still have to incentivize by paying some cut from the profit to the validator. Whereas here, if the validator has already committed to the transactions, you can actually run this backrunning purely for the benefit of the users. So all the backrunning profits would go to the users, and you may be kind of giving, say, some epsilon value to the validator. You don't have to cut in the validator during the backrunning auction. And finally, PROF-Share also has this property where the users are being backrun together. What that means is you don't have to backrun them one by one. And so as a result, users benefit from kind of organically backrunning each other. So consider the example where one user is trading, say, in the positive direction. For example, they're buying some dollars for ETH. If the other user trades right after them in the opposite direction, they would get a better price as a result. So what you want to do is backrun these transactions as a bundle, and Prof ensures that all its users are backrun together, and they get the benefit of organically backrunning each other. All right, so we conduct some utility analysis for these mechanisms, PROF-Share, and some redistribution mechanisms like MEV-Share, MEV-Blocker, and so on. The model is you have a DEX, which is a constant product AMM. You have an external market against which arbitragers can arbitrage and get some profits. You start out with these markets being balanced, and then each user is trading some unit quantity in randomly either direction. Let's define a concrete parameter called demand ratio. Demand ratio informally means how much demand is there in the transactions. So for example, if all the users are trading in the same direction, you have a very high demand. If users are trading in opposite directions such that they kind of cancel each other out, you have, in some sense, a zero net demand. And as you might have guessed, if they're trading in opposite directions, which is if the demand ratio is small, you have these benefits of organically backrunning each other. So this is the utility analysis for PROF-Share, PROF, and other redistribution mechanisms. You can see that PROF-Share always gives you better utility than other mechanisms. There are two reasons for this. One, well, you are protecting users, so they are not vulnerable to extraction. Second, you're also redistributing any profits that are created by backrunning those transactions. So PROF-Share always gives you the best utility. In some sense, it's a strictly better mechanism. Prof also does better without even redistributing things, because as you might have guessed, if you're organically backrunning each other in the Prof bundle, then you can compensate for some redistribution that way. So in low demand ratio regimes, Prof has these benefits of backrunning, organic backrunning, and you can get good utility in Prof even without redistribution. And on the right, you see that a lot of blocks fall into this regime where they have low demand ratio, in the sense that the market is not always moving in one direction or the other direction. It mostly moves sideways. So you have low demands in most of the blocks, which means it's a good regime for doing organic backrunning for the users. All right, I want to highlight some flexibility parameters in Prof. As I said, we have designed the system to be practical from day one. The first one is you can have multiple sequencers. There need not be just one Prof sequencer. You can have multiple sequencers, and in fact, these sequencers can have different ordering policies. We are not tied down to one ordering policy like, say, first come, first served. You can even run auctions inside Prof sequencers. These sequencers can either operate concurrently, where their bundles are being merged concurrently in parallel, and you choose the best enriched block as a result. Or you could also merge different bundles from different sequencers, and you create like, a mega enriched block from different sequencers. Second, PROF sequencer here is really a black box, as you might have already seen. It need not be a centralized entity. In our prototype, we implement it as a centralized entity inside TE, but it could be a decentralized protocol like that has been proposed in the community, such as Equitas, Themis, and all those other fair ordering protocols and blind ordering protocols. So it can be a decentralized protocol that's ordering transactions fairly. So in conclusion, PROF is a simple, backward-compatible system that's designed for protecting users while accounting for the rational model of the validators. And in our opinion, because PROF leads to these win-win dynamics where users benefit as well, validators are always given the best block, relays are more competitive as a result, and builders' blocks are also more competitive because they are getting enriched. If they don't support PROF, they don't need to, but if they are working with, say, optimistic relays, they might have to merge the bundles there. It leads to win-win dynamics for all and shifts the power balance towards users. And so the endgame thesis that we have here is that transactions that want top of the block can go through the gauntlet of the auction. They can compete in these auctions. And it also has some positive effects where you kind of take out the negative externality of latency racing. So the top of the block can be auctioned off. But all the other transactions that don't want the top of the block should go through PROF because it provides them higher economic utility while also guaranteeing good inclusion for their transactions. To learn more, I would encourage you to go to the website. It has several FAQs. You can watch a demo of PROF that is landing PROF-enriched blocks on the relay by forking of the relay code that is put out by Flashbot's open source. I would also highlight that Uniswap Foundation is kindly sponsoring $50,000 for anyone who wants to help us build the PROF implementation into a more mature implementation, thanks to them. You can also track the announcements and contact if you have more questions. And the PROF paper just released a couple of days ago. I would really encourage you to check the paper. Because it's designed in a practical way, it has a lot more details. I would like to thank my collaborators, Nerla, Yan, Ujjwal, Mahimna, Khosla, Andrew Miller, and Ari Jewels. With that, I can take questions.
Oh, hello. Cool. Hey, Kushal. Great talk. I might have missed it, but in PROF-Share, you said that the validator has to first commit to signing the header blind before the background auction takes place. How are they able to sign over a second header that's SIG H2 without equivocating in the protocol view?
Yeah, that's a great question. So PROF mechanism requires only modifications at the relay, as you might have guessed. But in PROF-Share, you have to modify the MEV boost adapter as well to be able to sign two headers, one for the committing the PROF block, and second after the backrunning auction. And crucially, if you notice here, the headers, that is step 2 and step 7, are going into the TE. And the TE enforces that it will never release two headers. It will only release one header so that the validator is never at the risk of equivocation. So yeah, that's a great question.
OK, thanks.
Thanks. Thanks for the talk, Kushal. A couple of questions. One is on the latency analysis you did. So it seemed like the primary analysis was looking at the value of blocks through time in the slot, but that sort of is like a measure of the absolute MEV available. But one other way that latency also plays a role is in the sort of adverse selection sense. So if you look at different relays, I suspect this is the case. I don't have the data on me, but if you look at different relays, I think you'd see block builders basically shading their bids on slower relays because there you have more adverse selection where competitors going through faster relays might be able to maneuver faster than you. And so I think one, maybe, unless you guys already did this, one interesting analysis here would be to look at relays which are slower than others and see if people shade their bids through those as well, because I think that might be a more relevant latency analysis.
Yeah, that's a great point. So if you look at the paper, we did analysis for all the major relays. So this graph is for Flashbots, I should have mentioned. But the paper has similar analysis for ultrasound and agnostic. We see similar patterns. So you would see the same inclusion likelihoods for other relays as well.
Sure, but I'm saying across the relays at the same point in time, or are they seeing bids of equal value? I suspect not, because if you're like a market maker and you have a slow avenue to getting on chain and a fast one, the fast one just presents you much less adverse selection.
That's right. So the claim that I make here is that all else being equal, a PROF-enhanced relay should be more competitive. So what that means is, if you are anyways a fast relay, you are going to be more competitive if you also enrich your blocks in some sense. So this analysis is for a relay and making it more competitive with enrichment.
But isn't there then a latency penalty that the fast
That's
relay?
what we calculated for all the relays. So even if you have that latency penalty, your inclusion likelihood for PROF doesn't reduce, and the original workflow of relays is not disturbed. You still have the concurrent path of PROF auctions, of the MEV auctions, so that path is not disturbed. So the latency is coming in the concurrent path, and the original workflow is not disturbed. So if you are worried about the relay becoming less competitive suddenly because of latency, that's not the case, because it's all concurrent.
Okay.
Yeah, we can take it offline.
I'll speak to you
Yeah,
offline.
definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. Just a quick question on the latency side of things. With like timing games becoming more and more prevalent, are there, just out of curiosity, solutions to run traditional block building with PBS and then the PROF bundles in parallel in any way? Or will there always be that latency penalty? Because I'm thinking that if the latency penalty is too high, the only way to address that is by increasing the transaction fees to get included in the PROF bundle, which then disincentivizes users to use it in the first place.
Right. So here's the answer. If you look at the paper, we analyze it in very carefully in detail. The idea there is you have these latency games because they're kind of targeting a deadline. Now in PROF, what you would say is at this time, say 11.9 seconds, I'm going to enrich the block that I have with PROF bundles. So all the validators or all the builders who are playing these timing games, instead of targeting a deadline of 12 seconds, they'll target a deadline of 11.9 seconds. So it's just a matter of shifting that deadline a little bit, making it known to the players, and in game theory-wise, they would kind of get their blocks in just in time for enrichment.
Under the assumption that everyone uses PROF, though.
All else being equal. So
Right.
whoever is using it, to that extent, it applies.
Got it. And it stays competitive with PBS-only builders.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you.
Yeah, quick question. So if there's a clear, transparent ordering policy used with PROF, and there's a party at the user level which has a lot of order flow, wouldn't it make more sense for that party to withhold order flow and extract the MEV revenue at like the top layer of the stack instead of submitting it to PROF? And maybe second part, have you compared it to like application layer auctions such as Sorella Labs, where you have competition between solvers building bundles? And have you looked at that comparison to PROF?
So I'm not sure if that actually applies. So the idea is simple. Users who want protection just go through this protected route. You don't have any kind of leaking of what those, any arbitrage opportunities. So suppose that you start up a sequencer, okay? And you are just starting the sequencer in a way that's fair. For example, it could be fair ordering, blind ordering, any other ordering. If it's run in TE, it's not kind of exploiting users. You have that flow, and you just give it to a PROF supporting relay, which would just enrich the block with those transactions. So in that sense, you don't have any competition going on inside PROF bundle. So the kind of insight here is that you can have a block where there's a competitive path, an auction path, where there's lots of these competitions, arbitrages happening, but users who don't want anything to do with this, who want protection, just go through a different path, and everybody's incentivized to include them. So it's a merging of the two things.
So the user would have to choose at the application layer to send through a different RPC?
That's right. So if you are a user, you just select your favorite PROF sequencer. If you trust the PROF sequencer is good, for example, it's running on a TE, decentralized protocol, any of that, right? Then you send your transactions to that sequencer will forward it through a relay, get it included, and so on.
Okay, so you need adapted user behavior at the DEX level, for example. Like if I'm Uniswap, I need to choose a different RPC, but then it would work.
Yeah, I wouldn't comment on protocols, actual protocols, and Uniswap and so on. I'm just saying if you are a user and you are an educated user, you care about your transactions, send it through a protected route.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kushal. I guess the vibrant discussion is a testament to the interest for this. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much.